I'm joined today by John Kuhn. He's a public school superintendent in Texas, a vocal advocate for education, and also author of the book Fear and Learning in America. John, it's really great to have you. There's so many different things I want to talk to you about, but maybe a good place to start is the so-called education reform movement, which is a movement that you say is riddled with scare tactics. So let's start there. What are some of the scare tactics in what is being called the education reform movement?
Yeah, well, so the education reform movement really got its start, or the modern education reform movement got its start in 1983 with a report from the U.S. government called A Nation at Risk. And that report was a really hyperbolic overstatement of problems in the American education system. From that point forward, there's been just this industry of hand-wringing and producing reports and publications decrying the quality of American public schools. A more realistic view of American public schools is that they're not perfect and they never have been. In fact, going back to the 1960s when the first international tests were given to developed countries, the United States scored 11th out of 12 countries on the math test. So there is no sudden crisis in American education. The fact is we've never been good when measured simply by standardized tests. But when taking a look at our students and our schools more holistically, our students compete very well in the world, and you can see that by the fact that those same kids who were in schools in 1983, when A Nation at Risk said, frankly, that our physical safety was at risk because of our schools, those kids are grown up now, and they're running our businesses, they're running our governments, and if you look at Chinese schools versus American schools, we do underperform on standardized tests, but our graduates produce more patents, they start more businesses, they take more risks, and they're more creative.
Okay, so there's so much stuff in there that is related to different myths and so much that's said. So let's see if we can unpack some of these piece by piece. First and foremost, you said that, okay, while it is true that on standardized tests, there are other countries whose students are doing better than American students, that if you look, is it both at productivity in employment and success measured in some particular way that actually graduates of American public schools are keeping up?
Yeah, I mean, there are a whole lot of different ways you can measure the quality of what an education system produces. Standardized tests, we have taken to using those mainly because it's easier. We love measurement in the United States, and we love black and white measurements in the United States. So what we want to be able to do is say, our schools are better than your schools, or our schools are worse than your schools. So we've boiled it down to standardized tests, and that's basically the only point of data that we look at to make these judgment calls. Because we do that, our judgment calls are not accurate. We overstate problems and we understate successes because the successes that we have in terms of, for example, creativity, they're hard to quantify.
So let's pick up on the standardized testing part of it. I get a lot of people who write to me and they're against using standardized testing as either the sole or primary way of measuring how well students are doing, but often they're not completely able to articulate exactly why it is that they feel that that's not a good idea. So can you give us a sense, as specifically as possible, of what the downfalls are to instituting a standardized test measuring system for evaluating students?
Yeah, well, so there's nothing wrong with testing in and of itself. I was a classroom teacher for a lot of years and I gave a lot of tests. Tests have a role as a tool, but when they become the only tool you're willing to use to judge the quality of your education system, then you basically become blinded to everything else and you get tunnel vision where you look only at the test. The natural consequence of that we're seeing in classrooms across the United States right now is that our teachers, that's the only thing that matters. So that's the only thing they focus on. And of course, you've heard the phrase, I'm sure, teaching to the test.
Right.
That's absolutely rampant in our schools in Texas and in every other state because teachers' livelihoods are on the line based on test scores. Your school's reputation is on the line based on test scores. Students' advancement in their classes and their graduation are on the line based on test scores. All the other great things that happen in schools, whether it's extracurricular activities, vocational education, programs that kids are involved in, those things get very little attention, and yet those are the things that we are so good about in the United States. Our kids are involved in a number of activities that we just basically, not just us as citizens, but the media, Politicians, we just ignore all that other stuff because there's not a single number on a spreadsheet that we can hook it to.
And this seems to me to be directly connected to this other issue of teachers. And we hear some politicians use this very coded language, which is we need to reward our best teachers, right? And that politically means a bunch of different stuff. So along those lines, is there something unrealistic about this term to reward good teachers in terms of what it might imply we would see from these so-called really good teachers? Are the expectations even reasonable?
No Child Left Behind stipulated that in 2014, 100% of American kids would be proficient in reading and math. And the word proficient, that's a nice way of saying they'll pass their tests. Well, 100% of students in no country ever in the history of Earth or any other planet has ever passed all their tests. It just doesn't happen. So to set that in statute and say, oh, we're going to do it, that's great political theater. Unfortunately, it gets translated into real life here on the front lines where I live, where the rubber meets the road in education. And so it's a really dumb thing to do. It's a dumb thing to set all your teachers up for failure and to create this sort of hysterical response to a policy where we're not trying to educate kids anymore. We're trying to not be, hung up in the central square as giant failures. And so that's what our entire education policy right now is built on fear. That's why the title of my book in giant red letters is Fear and Learning in America. The fear has gotten bigger than the learning. This all takes place in a historical context where the United States over the years has always looked for scapegoats to blame our social failings on. And so around World War II, we interned Japanese Americans. We've always had these scapegoats. And so we're living in an era now where because government doesn't want to take accountability or responsibility for policies that can help or hinder equality and poverty and those things, it's just a whole lot easier to say, well, if our teachers would just step it up, everything would be fine.
Well, this is connected with another issue. And because you're in Texas, this is of particular interest to me, which is, of course, you're aware of the movement in Texas around textbooks. And there's the movie, I think it's called The Revisionaries, which is based around the rewriting of textbooks to inject religious doctrine into them. And a lot of the things we're talking about, in addition with the religious component, are being used by some to push school voucher programs, for example, which will pull even more money out of the public education system, sometimes under the premise that a more religious education will be better, sometimes under the premise that private industry is better than the government at anything, including education. Tie those things together as they're going on in your state.
Yeah, and that's a key part of my book, too. You can't disassociate school accountability methods and methodologies from political and ideological preferences of the people who are building these systems. And so, when you hear proponents of these test and punish measures, they're going to tell you, oh, we just want to improve public schools. We want objective measures so we can see how they're doing because all kids deserve a quality education. And it all sounds really good and fine. But in reality, behind the scenes, there are folks with ideologies at play that are involved in making some of these decisions. Some of them have an ideology that is just kind of anti-public services. They don't really want to pay a lot of taxes to have quality public services. So one of the ways, that you can kind of advance that ideology is by constantly decrying the quality of the public services that you're getting for your tax dollars. You want to run down taxes, well, you kind of blow up the public education system. So there's that. There's also a whole testing industrial complex that has grown up around these systems that were devised in the aftermath of a nation at risk. Testing corporations like Pearson in Texas, for example, they have multi-million-dollar contracts. In fact, in the case of Pearson, their largest contract to date in Texas was $468 million to produce tests, which teachers, by the way, produce all the time for free. But it's taken on a life of its own. It's gotten so big and so valuable. You mentioned the textbook industry, which is kind of the same way. Now, tech industry has gotten to be this gigantic thing that really drives things instead of just providing a service, which was, what they should be doing.
We've been speaking go ahead, John.
I'm sorry. There's also the kind of anti-union component. There's an ideology at play in a lot of the states of the United States, which is to kind of push for what's it called, right to work laws. And I live in a state that is a right to work state. Teachers don't have the right to strike. They don't have the right to bargain for better working conditions and those sorts of things. And so a lot of people look at that and they say, well, we need that in our state. So one of the ways you can try to advance that is by kind of demonizing teachers unions. And so there's a real aggressive approach to that. And so all those things kind of get put into a big mix. There's a big recipe, and it's called school accountability, but it's very political.
We've been speaking with John Kuhn. He's a public school superintendent in Texas. I highly recommend the book, Fear and Learning in America. John, thanks for being on and tying together all of this stuff for us.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
This is viewer-supported independent media. Please support our program by going to davidpakman.com/membership and becoming a member today.